Welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. I am your host, Aaron Herbert. This is a podcast about stories, myths, and the Catholic faith. Hey everybody, welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies, and this is the episode that I'm joined by Christopher Ruocchio, author of the Sun Eater series, and I'm going to let Christopher introduce himself.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I'm glad to be here. As you said, my name is Christopher Ruocchio. I'm the author of the Sun Eater science fantasy series, which is published by Dog Books, and I've also been in the publishing industry for 6 years. I started as an intern working at Bain Books in January 2015, so it's almost 7 years, actually. I did a year as an intern there, and then I worked as a junior editor for most of the intervening time since. I quit working there in May, and I've been writing full-time. I've written 5 novels, the most recent one of which is going to come out or I guess the next one is coming out in March. I've written it, but it's not out yet. That's Kingdoms of Death, which is book 4 in the Sun Eater series. The last one that was out was Demon in White, and before that, Empire of Silence is the first one, Howling Dark is number 2, then Demon in White, and Kingdoms of Death. Man, that was numerically challenged. And then the outstanding one is The Lesser Devil, which is a sort of short novel that's set in the same universe. Everything I have written, with the exception of one Marvel Comics Thor story, is in the Sun Eater universe, which has been sort of my big project ever since I was a kid, really.
That's great. And yeah, you wrote a Thor comic. That's pretty cool. For Marvel.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
I got an email about 2 years ago from Steve McNiven, who's the guy who drew Civil War and Old Man Logan and a bunch of these things. He's an amazing artist, one of the best working now. And he said, hey, I just read your book, and I really, really liked it. I saw that you live in Raleigh. I happen to be in Raleigh for a convention. You don't happen to be here, do you? And I was there by cosmic coincidence. So I went and introduced myself, and a very weird, series of events ensued where he asked for my autograph, which felt very backwards, and then asked if I'd ever thought about writing for comics, and I told him no, because I have no idea how one gets into that industry. And apparently the answer, as in everything in my life, from not actually for publishing, but like when I got my job waiting tables, is the answer is who you know. So he got me into publishing, comic book publishing that way. So I've done the one story. Not sure if there's going to be any more, but it was real fun. It was real cool getting to work with him and to work with this character too. That's been a part of this sort of popular consciousness for ages, right? Depending on how you count, going all the way back to Viking times.
Nice.
But that was really cool.
That's great. That's really cool. So that was kind of a fun little a side thing you got to do, which is, I mean, like, that'd be awesome to write a Thor comic or any of the Avengers. It's especially for McNiven. Like, that's really cool. So I love Old Man Logan. That's such a good story. And so that's just cool. I thought I'd ask you that and get that. What's it called?
The story is called The Two Worthies, which is, of course, a little bit of a nod to the 9 worthies, and Thor's general worthiness. But it's going to be in Avengers 750, the big anniversary issue, which is out in November, this month, actually. It's November now, geez, on the 17th.
Cool. Oh,
so
great.
Like 2 weeks from now.
Nice. Yeah. All right. So when everybody hears this will probably be, the comic will probably have been out for a few months.
No worries.
But,
it's
still
November
go buy
now.
it. So, so that's cool. So so that's your Thor comic. And then you have your huge empire of the Sun Eater series. You have Empire of Silence is number 1, Howling Dark, Demon in White. And I'm about a third of the way through Demon in White right now. Cool. And it's fantastic. It's really, And I actually pulled some quotes that I really liked that go along with the questions I have. So if you don't mind, I'll read some of those. And,
no, not at all. That'll be fun.
And The Lesser Devil was cool too. I don't have it with me, but I loaned it to a friend. So tell us about the series. You have just kind of go with that. Tell us about the series you wrote.
Sure. So The Sun Eater is a space opera, science fantasy, I like to say, sort of in the tradition of Dune or Star Wars, have been influenced by other writers like Wolfe, Lois Bujold, folks like that. And it's set 20,000 years into our future. Mankind has spread across about, let's say, a third of the galaxy. With this big empire, and it is a story of a young man, at least at first, named Hadrian, who finds himself stuck in the middle of a war between the human empire and these aliens, the Cielsen, who are the first sort of technologically comparable species that humanity has encountered in all of its history that can pose a threat to them. Right, and so despite not wanting to be involved in this war, Hadrian, is stuck in it, lives his life in it, and books are written like a memoir, and he tells us on page 1 that he's the man who ended that war and dealt with the Cielsen. His story is why and how and about all the things that are not in the official record. Mm-hmm. So it's got that sort of memoir kind of bent to it.
Yeah. Well, the way you tell the story is really interesting because he is telling it from his perspective after all these events have happened, and so I think this is an older form of storytelling where the narrator will give you what happens at the end, closer to the beginning, right? And it's how you get to that point is what makes the story interesting. And so older Hadrian will drop and then this and then this happened, and it'll just like one sentence, and then but not until I got to Vorgosos, or something. So he'll drop a name or something, or he'll like reference an event, and you're like, whoa, like that's really ominous, and
what does that mean? I think it'll be important later.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
And he'll go into these like philosophical or theological like tangents, kind of like reflect on something, which I just love. I just love how he kind of slips back and forth between present Hadrian, who's in the story, like the younger one, and then him like musing on some idea. It's pretty cool. It's a really interesting way to, at least I think it's an interesting way to tell the story.
Yeah, well, it's almost the only way I know how at this point. It's always strange writing because almost all of my short stories are from different points of view, because I've done about a dozen short stories in the same universe, and those will be your more traditional third person, and The Lesser Devil is also your more traditional close third, and making that change was very difficult. I almost miss I miss the character voice because I wanted to do first person, not because I wanted to imitate any particular person. Contrary to what a lot of people may think, I actually hadn't read Book of the New Sun when I started writing this.
Yeah.
I read it later. And I started doing the first person thing simply because I realized that if you're writing in first person, then there's no sort of dead text, right? Every word helps tell you something about the person who's telling it to you, right? Because the narrator is a character, right? And you can have a third person narrator who's kind of a character, right? But this makes it a lot more explicit. And so that Hadrian will take the time to tell you about these random, sort of digressions, right? Tells you about who he is in a way that's, illuminating to his character, but also is his fault if you don't like it, as opposed to, people will complain about Tolkien, digressing about the greenness of the wood, which those are, of course, passages that I value immensely, so I don't know what's wrong with the people who complain about this.
And they don't happen that often. It's kind of a misattributed thing to Tolkien, where he doesn't do that much.
It's a way of signaling that you haven't actually read Lord of the Rings, or at least recently.
Right.
When people say that, you're like, we did not read the same book. I understand if you don't go in for poetry, and you're like, what is this Arundel thing that went on for 4 pages? And when I say awesome, people might not be satisfied with that answer, but the first person lets you really sink into a person's head in a way that you can kind of do in third, but not really.
Yeah.
Certainly not on like a rhetorical level in terms of how the text works. So I really, really wanted to do this character study of this character who, you know, is several hundred years old, and how he deals with that, and with the weight of all of these terrible choices that he's had to make in his life, because it's not an easy life by any means.
So Hadrian, you want to tell people, like, I think it's on the first page of, you know, the first book.
Oh yeah,
like,
sure.
What did he do? You know, that he's,
right.
Yeah.
So, like I said, he's the guy who ended this war, and he did that by destroying an entire solar system. Mm-hmm. Right. So what he did was blow up the sun. How is something that I have not explained yet, and when, and the precise circumstances of why. Because those are the interesting questions. What happens? If you could put the story in anyone's story in a Wikipedia article and convey the same amount of detail as the book, then it's not a good enough book, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be more stuff. And so those questions, you know, why and how are more interesting than what, I think. And this is true of any story.
Yeah.
But I wanted to sort of take the what partially off the table by giving it to you at the beginning, like we were talking about. Right. And so he tells you on page 1, you know, I am this guy, I did this horrible thing. Was it necessary? Well, you know, I'm going to leave that up to you. Let me show you, right? Because, you know, of course, showing people is more rhetorically effective than
right,
and dramatically entertaining than just giving a defense speech. You know, and so
and it's kind of interesting because it's all from his perspective. So is Hadrian, like, how warped is his perspective, right? How biased is he? Like, does he have, like, he obviously has a viewpoint, right? So you can't factor that out when you're listening to it. He's not a neutral party in this. It's really interesting. So it's like, I blew up the sun, you know, basically committed genocide, but it ended the war, so that was good, right? But it's also not good that it happened, and so he leaves it up. I mean, obviously you're not even done writing the series yet, but or I mean, you might be. It just hasn't been published.
No, I'm not. I wish.
I guess I shouldn't assume, but so it's a really cool premise, so you have this, so you have the empire, like the solar empire, and it has all of these, like, it's imagery of knights and kings and princes and aristocracy and the peasant class. You know, you have this, like, this hierarchical kind of society, and a lot of that pulls from, and the people in that society kind of draw this identity from these older stories, like of Arthur and El Cid, you know, and all of these legends and stories from Earth's past that they kind of appropriate.
Right, and cultures too, right? They're very Roman, they're very Byzantine, but they've got some elements too, like Imperial China and, and things like that as well. Yeah.
Right. So speak to that, I guess. This is such a vague question, but
so, of course, like, none of that's revolutionary, right? I'm far from the first person to have done anything like this, right? But what I do think makes it a little bit different in my setting is that it's all very self-conscious. Or it was. There's a great a piece one of my readers wrote, I think, on his, like, Medium account or something, that was about how the setting was basically a LARP gone too far, right? Because what had happened, right? And this is one of the bits of the story that I owe, you know, to Frank Herbert, right? Because in a lot of ways, the other thing that should be said about the series is it's kind of a response to Dune. Mm-hmm. Right. I love Dune. It's one of my, even though Tolkien didn't, right? It's one of my favorite science fiction novels. But I've always disagreed with it pretty deeply. You know, if you talk to a lot of Dune fans, they like the first book, but they start to drop out in book 2 pretty quickly, and by book 4, they're almost all gone. And this is you know, without even getting to the prequels and the spin-offs and things like that. And I've always thought it's because that people didn't like watching their hero from book 1 turn into the bad guy, and for reasons that aren't very much on the page in the series, right? It's we're told that Paul Atreides turns into this, you know, space Genghis Khan, but we don't see any of the battlefields, right? We don't feel any of the the heat of those battles, right? It's just, book 2 is starting, and Paul is kind of the bad guy now. Please keep up. And that was very jarring to me as a kid.
Yeah.
It does work, but I think a lot of people lose patience with the Dune series because of that.
Yeah.
And I never really liked it either, because I liked Paul, right? Especially in book 1. He never does anything wrong exactly,
right.
At least dramatically speaking, right? He tries to get revenge on these people who hurt his family, and broadly succeeds at doing that, and becomes king of the universe, and that's all very cool, right? Good for him. And so but of course, you go and see Frank Herbert talk about heroes, and you read the epigrams in Dune, and he's talking about the dangers of charismatic leaders. And it's all well and good to say, hey, the great men of history, are dangerous, right? Like Alexander is dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Mostly to Alexander, but that's that's another thing. And all of these people are dangerous, but like that doesn't change the fact that people need them. Right, like people need heroes, and we used to need them in like a very immediate, like material sense. We needed an Alexander to protect our interests, right? As the citizens of Macedonia, right? We needed a Caesar or a Hadrian or a Trajan or whoever to keep the barbarians back, right? And it's very easy to say, all these people are dangerous and they're kind of monsters now, but that's because the world hasn't really had a need for that kind of extraordinary historic heroism in a while. In fact, we've been kind of actively selecting against it, which is again another conversation. And so I wanted to say, okay, Frank, I hear your criticisms, and I want to tell a story about a great hero that people need anyway, right? Yeah. Regardless of how catastrophic he may be. And so I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but to circle back, that was why I wanted to sort of root the story in Dune in similar world building. So we've got your warring houses, and your swords are back in fashion, that sort of thing, right? And all of that. And so for folks who like Dune, you'll recognize some pretty similar world building furniture, if you will, at least early on, because it begins to take some sharp turns. And one of those familiar pieces of furniture is this injunction against AI. It's nowhere near as radical as in Dune, right? Like there are, like in Dune, everyone's wearing, analog, watches and stuff, right? Like it's which is pretty cool, but my universe is by no means quite that, anti-technology, but it better not be thinking for itself. Right. And that was because, there was, in humanity's past, people had used AI, and the AI had used people to really make everyone's life miserable, right? And then things had gotten so bad that people decided never again. And so the Empire, which is the largest civilization in the galaxy in these books, very self-consciously has sort of embraced their humanity, right? They're kind of, hyper-reactionary in this sense. And they've picked up a bunch of these old traditional offices and institutions, fashion, music, sports, whatever, right? Gladiators are back too, right? That sort of thing, right? Because they want to be, air quotes, authentically human, right? And it's gone on for so long, several millennia, that no one really remembers that a lot of these bits of culture have been brought in inorganically and sort of put in place, right? It's the clocks run long enough that they kind of sort of, there's a layer of dust over everything. Nobody realizes the furniture was just sort of slammed into the room.
Yeah, it was kind of artificially constructed from bits of other cultures, it's really, but they did it because this can lead to the imperial religion, which I think is absolutely fascinating. The chantry, the chantry,
yeah.
Okay. And this imperial religion, that their main job, I think, from what I understand, their main job is to prevent people from, like, as they say, perverting the flesh. Like implanting technology, like merging man and machine, and like cloning, and like all these things. Pretty much every other sin is permitted in their religion. That's what it seems like, But like they really are against this sort of transhuman idea that we're kind of dealing with now of man and machine, man and animal merging together and creating something quote unquote better. So the Chantry they have some good points. But they're also kind of terrible in a lot of ways. So yes, and I think you said it in another podcast where you started off writing this series, and the Chantry was going to be this kind of ham-fisted critique of Catholicism. Is that right?
Not specifically.
Oh, okay.
It was supposed to be just this sort of, when I started writing, because we can get into where I was when I started writing, it was just sort of a straw man, evil fantasy religion, which there are entirely too many of.
Yeah.
And it was, it was just sort of conceived of that way. Of course, it's, like I said, right, the Empire's culture is built very, very cynically, right? Like they knew what they were doing. For whatever reason, it was easy enough to centralize those decisions early on in history. I don't want to explain all of the secrets, right? But it was possible for them to do this in a way that I think works on the page. But it was all pretty cynically done, right? And that applies to the Chantry's sort of religious teachings as well. They crib a bunch of theology from different places and smush it together and put a new coat of paint on it, and they know that they made it up, right? At least back in the day. Of course, the people who are running the show at this point mostly don't really know that anymore either, right? But it was what's that?
No, I just said it's been so long.
It's been so long that they've lost track of that. And when I started writing it, like I said, this was a ham-fisted sort of goofy fantasy religion. But as things went on, and I developed as a person, because I was working on Empire of Silence in a pretty radically changing period of my life, shall we say. And we can get into that maybe a little bit later. I realized that it would be more interesting if it was that in contrast to other things, right? Because just doing that in a vacuum is, boring, right? And so contrasting that with, a genuine faith, right? And the church makes a small appearance, right? But enough to make a counterpoint to all of this, right? And there are other characters who have other faiths too. The Zoroastrians made it to the future, so there are a couple of them. Knocking about, and they exist to provide a little contrast here, because maybe some and I hesitate to use the phrase systems of control, but maybe some of those are cynical and fake, right? But maybe some of them aren't, and we need to figure out what those are, or even what parts of these cynical ones are justified, right, or necessary. Because I don't want anything to be very simple, right? This is something that has been increasingly central to my thought process as a writer generally, is everyone these days is obsessed with like a gray morality, right? Like, like I love it when my heroes are bad guys, right? And, they just always miserable, terrible people and everything. Really the bad guys are just the good guys for the other team. It's not true, right? Like some people are just worse.
Some people aren't good.
But the reality is, like, even the worst people, are also good sometimes, or good in some ways or places, right? Everyone's got like everyone's got Smeagol somewhere under all of that calm, right? Prone to making a lot of Lord of the Rings analogies. I'm sure this is the right crowd, but
this is not a Lord of the Rings podcast. This is not a Tolkien podcast.
No, but
there's a lot of Catholic Tolkien podcasts out there, so
that's true. There are, and with good reason.
Yeah,
but in any case, everybody's got that little bit of Smeagol somewhere, and so like I tend to think of the moral landscape in my books as like hyper laminated, right? It's not gray, but it's like a stripe of white and then a stripe of black and white, black, until if you step far enough back, you're like, ooh, that's gray. But if you like really get into it, no, right? Because that's the way the world is, right? Like, it's very hard to do anything without, doing something bad, even as a second order consequence. Lord knows you can barely buy a T-shirt without, encouraging slavery in Bangladesh. Like, it's a difficult world to act in, and I try to keep a focus on that with my characters too, right? They may be doing good things for the right reasons, but there will be, second order consequences, or even first order consequences that are bad, right? And that's sort of the whole point of the series, right? We're talking about Hadrian's war crimes, right? Like, the alternative is humanity not existing anymore, in a very serious and present way. And it's very difficult, right? Like, when you are facing someone who's got a gun, not to fire yourself if you can, right? And maybe you should fire, right? But you are still doing something that is bad on the face of it, right? Killing someone is not good. But dealing with these questions is something literature is very, very well equipped to do. And so I try to keep stuff like that in mind. And so dealing with these religious institutions, fake or otherwise, in the story, right? The chantry is very fake. They still are trying to keep things at bay that are much worse, right? As the series goes on.
Yeah, that's what makes it interesting. There are worse things in the chantry, we
get a look at like what it's like, if people do start messing with AI, or they start to replace too much of themselves with technology, or do other things like cloning. Cloning is a big bad idea, right? And all sorts of things.
Yeah, you get into all that in your series. So what changed? Obviously, I don't think it's a secret. It says it on your Wikipedia page that you are a Roman Catholic. We talked about that earlier. I was born, but there was a bit of an awkward phase, as there is for so many of us. Particularly I would think in like the U.S. I suppose in Europe me
as
too.
Well. But it's I hate to use the word normal, but it's becoming so. And so I guess the short version is this. When I was in 8th grade, a bunch of people in my family started dying. All of my grandparents died in the same year. I lost a couple other people as well. And that was very hard, when you're, 13, 14, to deal with that sort of thing. And on top of that, I went from Catholic school to public school for high school. And that was very difficult for all sorts of other reasons. And I was just very, very out of place. And I could not be bothered, I guess is the phrase, to go to CCD, right, and things like that, and I just dropped off, and I don't know if it's to my parents' credit or discredit. They fought me a little bit about it, but they let me be. I think it's worked out, so I think it's to their credit, because I think if they pushed harder, that it could have gotten a lot worse. Because by college, man, it was pretty bad. By college, I was a member of the Secular Student Alliance, right? Which I
Did you have a fedora? Did you have a fedora?
I had a fedora before that phase of my life because I liked Indiana Jones.
There you go. Okay, that's a good reason. All right. You're not just neckbeard and fedora.
No. No, but I still do wear long coats.
That's okay. We'll forgive you.
Yeah, that's probably cool, right?
Yeah.
But I joined the Secular Student Alliance, which I of course did because I wanted some kind of community, which that didn't work out, and then I ended up, I met Richard Dawkins, right, through all this, came to the school and things like that. So like to paint a picture of the sort of place I was in, had dinner with Richard Dawkins, not one-to-one or anything, but that was a thing. And so I ended up leaving them though, when they, and this is one of those things that, like, it doesn't seem like it should be as big a deal, but it really bothered me. They were all in their Facebook group making fun of a bunch of these, and I can't remember the exact nature of the story, but it was these high school student athletes who were, part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes who got suspended for praying in school. And they were like, ooh, wrecked, right? We got you. And I'm like, you were a bunch of, like, grown-ups, because there were, like, professors in this group, right?
Oh.
And grad students who were like, ooh, got you. And like, you guys have made a lot of noise in the past several years, and I believed you about being, the morally superior class here, and you're bullying children in absentia, really? Like,
yeah.
And I told them as much, like, this is ridiculous, and if you are better, act like it.
Yeah.
And I quit, and I, immediately, like, the same, like, 30 minutes, I quit, and I, like, broke off my membership and made sure I wasn't giving them any more money, and and then I lost a couple friends in the ensuing weeks over that. But like, bullying kids is like it's barely acceptable if you're another kid, right?
Yeah. Well, and I made fun of the seculars with their fedoras. I shouldn't do that. I feel bad now.
Well, we can make fun of the platonic, fedora man meme, right?
Like, I was like that too. I mean, I shouldn't make fun.
It's a shame, right? Because it is a good hat. But I don't know that the 1920s are coming back, right?
It's a good hat.
And so at that point I was sort of calling myself agnostic, I suppose. And that was when I was really, really getting into writing, because this was also approaching the back half of college, and my plan was to get an agent before I graduated, which actually happened.
Oh, nice.
Which I don't recommend, because my plan was something like, I'll write a book, and this whole waiting tables thing will, cover me in the meantime. And that was very foolish, but I was very fortunate. Yeah. In that it worked out, because I got the book written. This would be in 2015. I got the book written, got an agent in November, and then January 2016, I graduated in December, and then in January I sold the book. But that was a very interesting time for me too, because it was around that time that the whole Jordan Peterson thing happened. Mm-hmm. Sorry, lost my words for a second, because I was sort of ground floor with him. It wasn't even the Kathy Newman thing I was in before then. Mm-hmm. And I went through like every lecture, actually every lecture that he had on this channel. And there was a time, basically up until he got sick and dropped off the face of the earth, where I was listening to everything. Yeah. Me too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought he was great. And and so I listened to everything that he did, right? I thought Maps of Meaning was great, but I really liked the Genesis series that he did, because Genesis is probably the part of Scripture that gets most memed on by people who don't who don't read it, right? Right. And it's not like like this sort of the person that Richard Dawkins is debating is a 14-year-old, right? Yeah. Whose parents went to like Liberty U, and they go to the Ark experience for summer vacation, right? Like, like there's been a long tradition of, like Augustine doesn't take Genesis the way that like a lot of American evangelicals take Genesis, right? Like, and there are Jewish writers who don't take it, I hate to say it, take it allegorically, because allegory is too poor a word, right? But they took it symbolically, they took it non-literally, like, and there's a bit where I think it's Peterson talking about that the fundamentalist claim for the creation story is fundamentally a scientific one, and the hypothesis just doesn't bear out, right? It's a very materialistic, the fossil record is going to show, on the first day, like that's not, that's not how,
like, that's not what Genesis is doing. We need to stop.
It's not what it's for, right? And, and of course they've got issues with, Adam and Eve, and their relationship, and original sin is an idea, because of course people are wonderful blank slates, don't you know? And you can do whatever you want with them. and they don't like Noah and the flood. And of course, once you get to like Abraham, they stop reading, the Wikipedia article, and
right,
so
not even the Bible, just the Wikipedia article.
Yeah, of course not. Right? Yeah, I'm being a little too acerbic, probably, but it's late. But to have the book explicated in the way that Peterson did, right? To have Genesis explicated in this way, which wasn't, it wasn't scientific's not the right word, right? It wasn't doing the sort of like fundamentalist materialist thing.
Yeah.
But it also wasn't being, very religious. Was exactly the sort of threshold take that I needed to hear. And so that got me, and of course, midway through, he starts talking to Jonathan Pageau and doing like pre-lectures, right? And I love Jonathan Pageau's channel, and Jonathan's great. I got to talk to him about heavy metal, which was very, very fun talk. Yep. And he actually let me preview his St. Christopher graphic novel.
Oh, really?
He's got work. It's really great. Folks should check it out. It's called God's Dog.
Nice.
And actually, the Pageau thing about St. Christopher really got to me because, of course, it's my name, right? Yep. And he,
my son's
has
name
a great,
too.
Yeah. He has a great video about the St. Christopher story and because I hadn't heard the whole one. Like everyone knows he carried Jesus across the river part, right? Because we've all got the medals in our car. But there's an earlier bit, and I don't know if this is more of an exclusively Eastern Orthodox thing or not, but where St. Christopher, who is sometimes depicted basically as a werewolf, which is kind of cool, is a cynocephalus, right? But he goes around the world trying to serve the highest power he could find, right? So he serves king after king, the emperor. Then he learns the emperor is afraid of the devil, right? So he goes and seeks the devil out, who in the story I imagine is as Ganondorf, because he's, just described as this, like desert warlord. Right. And I'm a big Legend of Zelda fan, so my brain immediately is like, oh, this is, I need this movie, right? And then he eventually leaves the devil to go worship Christ, or to try and find Christ, because he learns that, of course, is afraid of Christ, right? And he can't find him because, of course, this is after Jesus is come and gone, right? Sometime in the first few centuries, according to the story, and finds an old man who, very very Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha suggests that he maybe try to pray, right? It's like, praying, nah. Fasting, no, I'm not doing that either. But then the sage, the saint is like, well, maybe, carry people across the river and you can serve God in that way. And he's like, that I can do, right?
Yeah, you're big and strong. Yeah, you can carry people across the river. Yeah.
Then, yeah, exactly. I can at least do that, right? And there's something about that really spoke to me too, and that really got me sort of moving back home, so to speak. And that's been a long process, right? My wife, when I started dating her, was sort of a lapsed Baptist, and she she was in Miami for grad student work, and she had no friends, basically. She's in the lab all the time. Yeah. And she's very extroverted, so this was a very, very hard thing for her. Very hard situation, another state, no friends, working all the time. And she's like, there's a Catholic church on campus. I'm thinking I'm just going to go, right? And she knew that I was like sort of a lapsed Catholic. She's like, is that like weird for you? And I'm like, no, like fine. So she calls them, and the RCIA meeting is that night. So she's like, oh, I'm going to go, right? And so that just started, and I had to explain to her parents that, don't worship statues, right? 1, 2, this is not my idea, right? This is all her, and maybe there's some other help, but it was not me. Right. I did not do this. Please don't be mad at me, future father-in-law. And they've been very good about it, but that was the whole thing. And so her journey helped sort of pull me along, which is which is good, and it's kind of that's kind of how it happens. I think in a lot of cases, even even in scripture, right? Guys are too busy being depressed in the upper room. Yeah. So wow. yeah, so I owe Jenna a lot. It's been a long sort of way back, and I wouldn't say that that it's done either, right? Like nothing's ever finished, and so it's been a long sort of struggle back uphill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but well, that's pretty similar to my story. I won't get into it, but it's pretty similar. It's often the women that get the men to turn their head toward the right direction, right, or even the wrong direction. Yeah. But it's usually that's usually how it works. Is the girlfriend, the wife, converts first, or starts practicing their faith more fervently, and then the husband eventually joins. It's kind of how, and then the whole household kind of goes. So how has your reversion affected your writing, your storytelling?
We touched a little bit on how I realized I was being ham-fisted with the state religion, right? And so the most immediate sort of impact there was to fix that, right? Yeah. And it was something actually to fix in revision, because the book had sold at that point. And so it was something that got changed very, very late to be made more explicit. But I also had to completely, basically, rewrite the first book after I'd sold it too. When I sold it, it was half as long. And my first editor, bless her, was like, "I love it, but I have two problems with it." And they were very fundamental world building issues. And I decided it was basically easier to rewrite the whole thing than try to fix it. Because trying to edit line for line is annoying. I'm doing it right now for book 4, and it's my least favorite part of the process, because I'm such a linear thinker that to go back and say, hang on, if I change this here, is there something earlier I have to fix too, or is it later? Right. And like, am I forgetting about anything? The constant sense of like, oh, you've forgotten a niggly detail somewhere is haunting, and I don't like it. So it's the worst part of the process. I decided to rewrite the whole thing, and I actually rewrote Empire of Silence basically from like chapter 15 on in about 3 months, because I didn't have a lot of time. And after which that editor promptly resigned, and my book got put on the shelf for 2 years. Or a year and a half, which is actually not uncommon in publishing.
Howling Dark, Empire of Silence came out in 2018, is that right?
18, but I sold it in January 2016. Okay. Which is by no means the longest wait that I've ever heard of in traditional publishing. It's difficult. There's only so many people who work in those offices, and they're always stretched thin. Those companies are all smaller than people think they are. Bain Books, where I worked, had 8 people, I think, on a full time.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah, a lot of it, like the copy editors all went freelance, but the like core editorial marketing staff is very, very small. We're talking like the nucleus of a hydrogen atom, right? Like relative to the whole space, right? And people only, of course, ever see the authors, right? So they assume this big, Madison Square, not a Rockefeller Center, is where a lot of the publishers are, right? Simon Schuster's there. They imagine this big Rockefeller Center, skyscraper full of office drones, and like, no, it's me. Right. I am the marketing department, that happens all the time, these sort of slowdowns. Yeah. But to get back to the question, that specific world building thing was first, but the general principle here, which was that I'd set up something originally that was too simplistic, right? That needed to be challenged, that needed to be counterbalanced, that needed to be complicated. Yeah. Was a general principle that became sort of central and increasingly important to me. To the point where sometimes Hadrian feels more like Hamlet, where he's like, if I do this, then this will happen, and then that will happen, which will balance it back out a little bit, but then if I kill Claudius while he's praying, he'll go to heaven, and I can't have that, so I can't kill him now. And there's a lot of sort of the like back and forth moralizing is a consequence maybe of this sort of hyper articulated need to give give the devil his due, right? To turn a phrase. But I when this is the sort of thing that bothers a lot of people when they read books, especially that bothers me when I read if nowadays if religion is not handled the the way that a religious person would handle it. Why is it in a book, right? It's like when someone who's not an engineer tries to describe an engineering problem. It's very upsetting. I tried to watch the Foundation show, and I'd forgotten how special Asimov was on the subject of belief. And it was, except for the big Earth of the New Sun reference that they added that wasn't in the books, I was not having a good time. And actually, that's not fair. The special effects are amazing. Yeah. And Lee Pace is always good in anything. But, I had to stop watching it. It was frustrating me. Yeah. Because this sort of thing sticks out, right? If you know better, and thank God I know a bit better now.
Right. Right.
So.
Yeah, it makes because the Chantry is really interesting because they have a good point, right? They're there for a specific purpose, and it's to prevent this artificial intelligence from emerging again. And the first time it did was terrible, right? So they exist for that purpose, but they also are a fake religion, and and there are a lot of problems with that. One of which is what happens when people find out. I mean, I'm not saying that's what happens or going to happen in your book, but when the noble lie is gone, right? And then you have the Catholic Church as kind of it shows up heavily in the Lesser Devil, which is really good. And the Catholic Church exists, as a separate, as its own distinct thing in your universe, which kind of makes, if someone says, well, a Chantry is just the Catholic Church. And I was like, well, actually, the Catholic Church is right here. Here it is.
And they're not happy about the Chantry.
No, because what I really like about the Chantry is that they take bits of other religions and smush them together, right? So, yeah, and they kind of have this veneer of they worship the cardinal virtues, right? Icons, the cardinal virtues.
So they're floating around and they're still one of the things the Chantry does, right? Because the Chantry's primary, again, air quotes, deity is Earth itself. Yes, right? Because the Earth is gone. They know where it is, but nobody lives there anymore. Mm-hmm. Because as a consequence of dealing with the AI, they had to wipe it out. Yeah. Right. They had to nuke the Earth, and this was 16,000 years ago. And so they worship sort of the idea of Earth, right? Which is the idea, basically, of this sort of promised homeland that they can all one day return to, maybe, right? But of course, practically speaking, that's not going to happen. There are way too many people that can ever fit on it. But that's another issue. But they have this very sort of environmentalist, sort of rhetorical bent, right?
Yeah, they're basically Earth worshippers. I mean, and then they have this this quasi pagan. I don't know how to say it, like belief system, if that's the right phrase, but. Because they have all these icons to different virtues, like prudence and fortitude and beauty, and the transcendentals are in there too, right? So you have beauty is one of these deities, and
So the rest of their deities, right? Because the other one that deserves special exception is the first emperor is also deified because he's the one who dealt with the machines, right? So he has a special role, and the current emperor as sort of a pharaonic reincarnation of the first, right? Not literally, they're not clones or anything like in the Foundation show. Which that was cool too, actually, in the show. But I'll give them that. It's not from the books, but I liked it. But the subsequent emperors are just the descendants of the first emperor, who have sort of a ceremonial role as sort of a living god, right? Which is of course very Roman, right? Post Augustus, right? But the rest of the I guess principalities, you might say, that the Chantry worships, or they have more in common with the Greek daimons, right? The sort of embodiment of justice, yes, right. Of prudence, temperance, fortitude, right? Those are so they've obviously cribbed the cardinal virtues, as you say, but also of just different things, right? So fury, right, is mentioned a couple times, but also just natural phenomena like time, and evolution appears as sort of an icon that they worship, and they'll light candles and make sacrifices to them, in temples and things as well, and they sort of imagine them as the Greeks did, as sort of personified abstract forces, right? And most people don't believe in them as like literal, like, oh, I can actually meet death, right?
Right.
But they recognize that's a symbolic representation of the idea of death, and they'll still, make sacrifices to death to ward off death, right? As the pagans would do, because they are very Greco-Roman pagan in that sense, or Indo-European pagan even.
Really, it's really interesting.
There's some Hindu elements too in the way that like the sacrifices are done and stuff that I actually haven't had a lot of time to focus on in the writing, but it is there.
Yeah. And so in your series, Hadrian, he comes from Megia. How do you say the planet's name?
Medwa is the town.
The town. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. There's too many names thrown around anyway. The town is Medwa, but the planet is Delos.
Delos,
as in the Greek island where Apollo is from. Was born on Delos. Of course, he brings the sun, right? So
right, yeah.
There's a little bit of a joke there.
So he comes from this family that their image is a devil figure on a pentagram, right?
Yes, yeah.
And I just had this thought yesterday. Like, you have a lot of devil imagery in this series, like a lot of it.
Yes.
And you have it in his family. If I could read just a quote. I think this is here. This is from Demon in White. The violet shouts of plasma fire answer her. More blue in the alien air than I'd ever seen. Sulfur in the air, if I remember my chemistry. I fancied I could smell sulfur even through the suit. The brimstone stench of hell. So like, and this comes up all the time, and it just clicked yesterday that he's got his family emblem is basically a devil, and in book 2, I mean, there's gonna be spoilers, whatever. When he goes to the hidden planet of Rogosas with Karn Sagara, who we were talking about this through Facebook. He kind of lives in this. He's like the Satan, like Dante's Satan, or like Milton's Satan, and he's like a combination of both. And he is this, we think, immobile ruler who lives at the bottom of this pyramid, like the bottom of the hierarchy, and in this inverted pyramid, and all these like Edenic sort of imagery on this planet, and he's kind of a Satan figure, right? So, and then another thing I noticed was the Cielsen themselves, where they kind of remind me of demons, right? And they're you kind of you explicitly call them demons like several times, I think, but I don't think it's necessarily a rhetorical. I mean, they're hermaphroditic, and so they don't have like distinct sexes. They're kind of sexless, which is
right.
Which is angels and demons are also, they're not hermaphroditic, but they don't have like a distinct sex. They're not. That's not part of their being.
Because that comes with having a body.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And they're. Let's see. I have something. Yeah. The Cielsen were undeterred. This is also from Demon in White. Their berserkers fought with little concept for their individual lives, and why shouldn't they? They were slaves, body and soul, servants to whichever prince they called their master, and that master had ordered them to fight. There was no room for disobedience in the common Cielsen soldier, no free will. They abdicated free will to their commanders, who were in turn the slaves of commanders greater still, until all served at the behest of an Iete prince, who alone was free and a god in all but truth. And that's so you have, and they live in like these giant like city planets that and they kind of live like insects, like they shun the light. So you have all of these like all this devil imagery.
Yes, and it's everywhere.
It's everywhere in there, and it just clicked yesterday. And if Hadrian constantly going, I deserve to burn. Like I deserve to burn for what I did. And so, and I'll just say one more thing. Hadrian Marlowe, his last name is Marlowe.
I noticed that.
Yeah, I did notice that. Christopher Marlowe was a playwright, I think a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he wrote a play, Dr. Faustus, who makes a deal with the devil. So that clicked yesterday too. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is deliberate. Come on, man, this is deliberate.
It's incredibly deliberate, and I actually worried it was layered on too thick. So if it's just coming to you now, that's good.
Maybe it was all the things building up. I'm like, okay, this is deliberate. Like he's
yeah. So it started out as a really stupid joke because I was an edgy teenager when I started putting all this together, right? And that is that my name is Christopher, right? And Marla's name is Christopher. So the great families of the Solon Empire, almost all claim some mythic historical ancestor.
Yeah.
Very few of which are genuine. And House Marlowe claims to be descended from Christopher Marlowe, which is impossible. He had no children, and he was very, very, very probably homosexual. In any case, he was also probably a spy, and he got murdered in a bar fight, which is very cool. Very interesting stuff. It might have been working for Spain.
Yeah.
Really interesting figure. And he was a friend of Shakespeare's.
Yeah.
And his death actually really, really rattled Shakespeare. I think it's in As You Like It. There's a character named Hero, which is a reference to one of his poems.
Okay.
I think it's As You Like It. It's been a long time. I used to know my Shakespeare a lot better than I do. It's one of those things like my Latin that's rotted since I left school.
Mm-hmm.
And in any case, not a lot of famous people named Christopher. And so he was the one I went to, and it was just a joke because when I started writing, I was like 7 years old, right?
Yeah.
And of course, when you're writing when you're 7 years old, the main character is you,
right?
And so it was me that was going to wizard school or to Tatooine or Hyrule or wherever it was that I was into at the time. I spent a lot of time in Middle Earth, as you might imagine. And I would write these, on the back of my homework assignments. The B side of all of my math notes was doodling and world building nonsense because I was trying to write since I was really, really small. But the first main character was me, right? And so to have the character's last name was Marlowe. It was, of course, a reference to Christopher Marlowe, but it was this little note that I'd started out writing self-insert fanfic when I was 7 years old. Right?
Yeah.
And so it was a stupid little joke. But when you're writing, you ought never to interrupt your subconscious when it's making a decision.
Yeah.
Because it's smarter than you are. Not to act like it's a totally separate organ, but it's a part of your brain that's a little bit more sophisticated, I think, than the the prefrontal cortex in a weird way. And so when all of these sort of symbolic things started to click into place, because of course, like what formerly military, family wouldn't use a scary monster as its sigil, right?
Right.
It's a perfectly reasonable choice. You go from there, right? All these things start to click into place. And then I realized that what I was doing, and I didn't realize this until the revision process on book one, was setting up a monster versus monsters sort of thing, right? Because that's what gargoyles do, right? They keep the demons out of the church.
Right.
That is what St. Christopher does. In a lot of Orthodox churches, they put the werewolf-looking St. Christopher right in the door.
And you have that in Lesser Devil.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Brief aside there. That's just because 20,000 years in the future, we've of course fixed our problems in the church, east and west at least.
Ah, nice.
So there's a little Orthodox Saint Christopher there at the door, just as a little. One of my very close friends is Greek Orthodox, and so sort of I don't know if the feeling there is at least reciprocal, but it would be very nice if that particular schism could be mended.
I agree.
Maybe one day, we have
20,000 years from now.
I figure 20,000 years from now, why not, right?
Yeah, nobody can remember what the problem was anyway, that long in the future.
Yeah,
what were we fighting about?
Anyway, so just a little bit of, I guess, of good, developments, put into the book. But yeah, it's what St. Christopher does too, right? He is a monster, at least a monster superficially, that keeps the other monsters out, right? And of course, that symbolic, resonance wasn't lost on me either. Yeah. Right. To go back to the personal development part of the story. And so to have all this going on, right, Adrian is a character who does some pretty horrible things. to try and save humankind, right? And like I said, it's not a gray morality thing. It's hard to act, at all without doing evil, right?
Yeah,
it really, really is. And so I don't want it to be
motivation.
Sorry.
So I think obviously I haven't read the whole thing because none of it's been published, but with Hadrian, he truly loves the empire, right? I mean, even though he knows it has a lot of problems, like a lot of problems.
Yes.
But he's like, there's a point in book 2 where he starts off very hopeful and I'd say naive when he wants to make peace between the Cielsen and the humans. He's like, well, no one's ever tried this before. I'll be the first one in 400 years to do this. And then they sit down and they get nowhere, and it's getting worse and worse. And he slowly realizes that, maybe these creatures are not capable of peace. Maybe they're not actually like us, that have free will. Maybe they just aren't capable of it. Maybe they're just monsters. And
because as we touched on that a little bit earlier too, and I think he got lost in the mix. Mm-hmm. The Cielsen, like we said, they don't have differentiated sexes, but right. They have this sort of subordinating instinct. As soon as they are beaten, they belong to whichever one of them beat them, right?
Yeah.
And so whole clans can flip ownership pretty easily, right? So they're all they're all capable of speech. They produce art and things like that.
Yeah.
But their whole society hinges on domination, which is of course how certain modern theorists think human society works. But the contrast here, hopefully, should demonstrate that that's not how human beings work.
Right.
But by showing you how it works with the aliens, and so that there's that element as well too, right? Because like the passage you read, they don't have free will except their kings do, which is a very pagan way of thinking.
Yeah,
right?
It is,
your average, Greek pagan was, you might be enthused. If you were angry, it was because maybe Ares or Kratos or something had you in his grip, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you make prayers to maybe keep the gods away from you, but you would, but you were all subject to the fates anyway. It was very deterministic. For the Cielsen, that's true, basically.
Right.
And except for their kings, who, of course, when someone actually in Greco-Roman pagan society is so great that they change history, they must of course be a god, right?
Right.
Or a demigod, because normal people, they can't affect the world in any meaningful way at all, right? It's very, they wouldn't have liked Lord of the Rings,
No.
And so of course, Alexander must of course be the son of Zeus, right?
Yeah.
Things like that, and the Cielsen think that way too.
Yeah.
Right? So their princes are the ones who make the decisions, but not the lesser ones. I just figured I should, expound on that from earlier.
The whole submission domination thing. I'm just kind of thinking about this now. Another way they're kind of like demons is that they that's kind of how demons kind of work, right? So before Christ came, right, the ancient Hebrew people, I think, someone might correct me on this, they had a list of all these names of demons, and then when someone was possessed, they would invoke a stronger demon to come chase the lesser demon away, right? And what Christ did is he came and he did it under his own power. And that's why they were like, whoa, what's going on? How can you be doing this under your own power? You can't do that, right? And so that's kind of what reminds me of the Cielsen. It's like one stronger will come in and dominate, and then their word for peace is also submission. So they don't really have a word for peace, which I thought was interesting. And so Hadrian kind of makes this decision, I guess. He makes this determination that, well, maybe we can't make peace with them. Maybe they're just monsters,
Right.
And I guess part of it is is he right? Are they really monsters? And a fun thing I wanted to do, I have this book called Science Fiction and Catholicism. It came out a couple years ago, and in there it has a section on, can aliens be baptized? And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to read off the requirements, what alien species are supposed to have by the Vatican, I guess. And if they're capable of baptism, and I'll see if you think the Cielsen will fit. I think I know what my answer is. So this is from by Jim Clark, Science Fiction and Catholicism. Catholic thinking has, at this point, resolved the question of alien salvation down to a series of qualifications which would need to be posed in the event of extraterrestrial life being encountered. In order for an alien species to require the salvation of Christ, they would have to be intelligent. C.S. Lewis defined this quality as not merely the faculty to abstract and calculate, but the apprehension of values, the power to mean by good something more than good for me or even good for my species. Additionally, they would have to exist in a physical dimension. Energy-based beings, in other words, would not require salvation via incarnation, as they themselves would not be incarnate. Some theologians have gone so far as to compare this speculative scenario with the concept of angels and even demons in terrestrial theology. Finally, such an alien species would need to be fallen, that is, in need of salvation. With this blueprint or methodology in place, the Catholic hierarchy is already prepared not only to theologically accommodate extraterrestrial intelligences, but also to interact with aliens and even consider baptizing them. So, based on those things, so they need to be intelligent, and they need to be capable of good, but something more than just good for me or good for my species. They need to be physical, which they are, and they need to be fallen, which I think they are. They're definitely, they're not good. But what do you think? Are they capable of salvation?
Well, I don't want to answer that question, right? Because I'm sorry, I don't want to give anything away.
That was a surprise. I didn't send you that question. I don't think. I wanted to
I will say though, as a bit of a dodge, right? They're not the only aliens in the series.
Right.
There are some other ones. The other alien species that appear are not as developed. They're basically they never got off their own planets yet.
Yeah.
So they're variously primitive or maybe medieval or whatever. And we don't see that many of them because they're very far flung. We're talking covered about a third of the galactic volume. We found a couple dozen, right?
Yeah.
And there are perhaps reasons for that, but the other ones we see, right? The way that I talk about it is this, right? The Cielsen look roughly human. They've got, they're humanoid. They've got the arms, the legs, eyes in the right place, things like that. But they don't think like us.
Right.
Then there is another species appears in book one, the Umand, who neither look nor think like us.
Mm-hmm.
We think they're intelligent, but are they? I'm not so sure.
Right.
And because it's too hard to know. And then there are the Urtani, who show up in book 3, who are like bird people, so they don't look like people. But they do kind of feel like people. Right? Yeah. They act like people. And so I obviously am open to the idea that there may be intelligent life on other planets that is, that is ensouled in the same way that we are.
Yeah.
And in need of the same salvation. But perhaps not all. Maybe some of the things out there. Because if it's intelligent in some way but not good, it's not exactly a person, right?
Right. Well, that's what when I read that, I'm like, okay, I don't think the Cielsen are capable of baptism. I don't think they
may not be.
Yeah.
Right. They may be
don't
basically
give it away.
demons, right? but I will say may not be, right?
Got it.
Maybe.
Maybe.
We'll see, right?
Oh man, yeah. I just thought that was a fun question. I couldn't resist.
It's a really good one, and it's one to revisit after the last book, I think.
Sounds good. So going back to like the devil imagery.
Yes.
Yeah. So we talked about he had he's got the crest of the devil on his uniform and on his family sigil and all these other things. Especially with like Karn Sagara on in the second book, tons of references to Eden and but it's all like inverted, right? So it's all upside down, literally, it's literally upside down.
Right, and Karn's house is a very strange place.
Yeah. And so why? I think I can probably guess why, but it is very deliberate, and I'm guessing it's because Marlowe is named after the guy who wrote Dr.
Right.
Faustus.
Well, like I said, it grew out of this dumb joke, but as you start to think about the choices that you've made as a writer, right? Because people think you have to people imagine that the act of plotting or brewing a book happens instantaneously. But there are things I'm revising my 4th book right now. I just sneaked a couple new paragraphs into a chapter that I was writing because I have a clear idea of what's going to happen 2 books from now.
Okay.
That I want to make sure that I look like I've planned all along, and by the time you read it, it will look like I planned it all along.
Yeah.
And sometimes too, like an errant detail that you will put down as like spontaneous, world building, right? Because when I'll do something like list 3 planets or something, maybe I'll reuse 2 and I'll make up a third one, right? And the third one will be new and it'll actually become important in some way, right? And that's very normal. The Tolkien approach, where you spend 50 years world building and then write 2 books, is commercially unviable, right? Unless you're Tolkien, right? And so we have this sense that we should emulate Tolkien, and we should in certain respects, but not in terms of his writing output. I would not be able to eat if I
well, he had a full-time job.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. I used to. Now I just make up nonsense. And so anyway, to the imagery, right? This stuff sort of grows, and there are like when you read the bit about the plasma fire, just smelling of sulfur, right? And the imagery there, that was spontaneous. I think that's from a battle on a Cielson ship. Yeah. And so that their atmosphere would have a little bit more sulfur in it. Is just me being symbolic, right?
Yes.
Which
but it's still there. This like imagery. Yeah, it's still. I don't know. It clicked last night and I got excited and I want to ask you about it.
Yeah, it's all very much there on purpose. Yeah. It's more incidental, right? The bigger stuff, right? Hadrian's sort of symbolic, association with evil, is because there's a bit of an inversion going on, right? And a question too, right? Is he the bad guy, right? But the answer might be no. Right, because maybe there's a great line in Book of the New Sun. I think it's in sort of the Lictor, where Gene Wolfe says something like, "Often an angel is only a devil that stands between us and our enemies." Right, and I think it's a really good line because, of course, the distinction between Michael and Lucifer is a choice, right? Yeah. And so that choice, right, is incredibly important, right? Yeah. That may be the biggest understatement in cosmic history, but but it is ultimately like a pretty small distinction, right? Like it's not like they're different in substance or aptitude or capability.
They're both angels.
Like that. Right, and so too, right, the difference between a hero and a villain. Not to go back to that silly canard about like, oh, heroes only, a matter of perspective, right? But it's a fine line, right? It is a fine line.
Well, it's a matter, like you said, it's a choice, right? So like you could be heroic your entire life and make the wrong decision, and it impacts everybody in a negative way,
right? Or vice versa, right? You can do some good things, and or you could be evil, right, and do one good thing, and then like, oh, Gollum wasn't so bad.
Right.
And that's like I said, right. You've got this hyper laminated sort of. Yeah.
It's not great.
The nature of morality is this very hyper laminated thing. Nobody is. Yeah.
It's similar
there is none righteous too, right?
Well, it's similar to what Gene Wolfe does too. Somebody once said that he doesn't have gray characters. They're pastiches of like good and bad, right? So they're. I mean, that's what people are, right? We sometimes do good things, we sometimes do bad things, but it doesn't mean that there's no such thing as good and bad, right? Or like evil and goodness. It's just we're complicated and it's hard to tell sometimes who is the good guy and who's the bad guy, right?
And that line gets thinner the more far-reaching the consequences of your actions are, right? So if you are an Alexander, right? Yeah. Then that line is very thin, right? You've got to be very careful. But that doesn't mean, as Frank Herbert would have it, that you shouldn't have an Alexander. Right? You may need one.
Well, like there are some Christians who, like with Alexander the Great, he did a lot of good stuff, right? And when the Christians came, we utilized a lot of the stuff he did, like Hellenizing most of the known world, and the roads that he built, and but I think it might have been Jonathan Pageau who said roads can, be good for missionaries, and they can also be good for soldiers, So it's like it goes both ways. So is Alexander the Great a villain or is he a hero? It kind of depends on. I mean, it depends
not even on where you're standing. It depends on where and when you're standing, right? But too, right? Like, Alexander's a really interesting case, right?
Mhm.
Because he, depending on what period of history you're looking at, all of the books about him are going to be these wonderful paeans, right? Or they're going to be incredibly negative, right?
Right.
This sort of modern scholarship on Alexander is like, oh, he's a proto-Hitler. Like, yeah, no, he's not, right? Like, that's not right. But he's also not this. He's not the character of the Alexander romance, right? Like that is a work of fiction, a very interesting work of fiction, or really genre of fiction. But he's not that guy either, right?
Even Hadrian kind of hints like, well, some people call me a monster, some people call me a hero, in reality, I'm just a man, basically. That's
right. Yeah, he doesn't really want to answer that question for himself either. I think he obviously has some memories he can't live with, right? But some of those are things that happened to him. And some of those are things that he did, right? And to try and show the messiness there is part of it, right? And that's really what makes the story, because stories are about people.
Yeah.
Right. People. It's kind of a canard at this point. Everyone will say, I like character-driven stories. Like, that's most of them, right? Science fiction has this sense that, like, oh, you need the plot or like the tech to drive it, and that's because for a long time you had John W. Campbell basically saying that's what science fiction had to be, right?
Yeah.
And before that, you had Gernsback marketing his magazine on the educational credentials of his writers, right? Like Doc Smith had a degree in like something crazy. It was like bees or something. I can't remember.
Entomology.
It was entomology, maybe. Don't quote me on that.
I'll have to look that up, because I'm an entomologist too. So.
Oh, cool! I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it might have been something like entomology or like or agriculture or something. But they passed him off as like a like a Bill Nye the Science Guy type, which of course Bill Nye is also sort of passed off as kind of a general science guy.
And he's not.
Yeah, he's an engineer, which is like that's not nothing. But like
show. It was a very good show, but now I don't know. Now he's like a moral figure, which is just weird. I don't get it.
Well, yeah, it is strange. But he's an engineer. He's not a physicist or a geologist or any of those things. And that's not to say you can't be conversant in that material. I'm conversant in that material to a certain degree, but anybody can be conversant. But anyway, I digress. As far as the devil symbolism goes, right? The main thing is precisely that inversion, right? You've got this sort of monstrous figure, but there are like little details that grow out of it. Another one, right, is another play that Christopher Marlowe wrote is Tamerlane the Great, right? Which is about Timur, the sort of Turkish, the last of the great sort of medieval sort of Turkish warlords before the modern era really kicked in. The Prince of Destruction, they called him, right? And it's a cool play, and that's of course where Hadrian gets the name for his ship, the Tamerlane. So there's another this other little Marlowe node, right?
Yeah.
So you've got all these little.
Yeah, I like that kind of stuff. It makes the story seem, it gives it verisimilitude, if I'm using that word correctly. It just makes it seem grounded in something real. Like Karnsagara's ship is the demiurge, which is something out of like a Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, which is like this deity that I don't remember, but it like.
It's the one that creates the universe, right? But it's the evil one that creates the universe.
It's the evil, and that's what Karnsagar kind of styles himself as this,
right, and he has a very Gnostic worldview too, right? Because what Karn's thing is, he's lived forever by copying himself into new bodies, right? So he believes that he has a solid division between his body and his spirit, and Hadrian encounters a lot of these different cultures, be they alien or human, that have these very different ideas about what makes a person. Right. Including his own. He doesn't agree with his own culture's, estimation really what makes a person, because the empire's got a bit of the eugenics bent to it.
Oh yeah.
And he's benefited from it. He's going to live for a very long time, but he is increasingly uncomfortable with that. Right,
because he's basically a synthetic human in many ways. Because there are these humans that are they're intices, right? They're
Yeah.
They are the product of basically procreation, but without the genetic like fiddling that makes because like their genomes are so complicated that they actually need imperial permission and then imperial like technology to get their genomes to work when they reproduce.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So the upper class, the imperial nobility, the Palatine palace class, right, are the product of very advanced, very complicated genetic engineering.
Yeah.
And one of the features of that engineering, and it is from the perspective of imperial civilization a feature, not a bug, is that it's very hard to have children naturally.
Right.
They almost always die, and if they don't, they have some serious problem.
Yeah.
They will be deformed in some way. They may be mentally handicapped. They'll have some condition, right?
Right.
And it's usually very idiosyncratic. And sometimes it's not that severe. There are some Intus children you can't tell. But on the other hand, you may have one who's 3 foot tall and has brittle bone disease, and
right.
Doesn't make it past 100.
Right.
And this is obviously one of those systems of control, right?
Right.
In much the same way that the shoguns used to keep hostages from all the daimyo families at court in. The emperor basically holds the future progeny of all of his lords hostage.
Right.
Right.
And it's something in Book of the New Sun. That's what the autarch does too with all the.
Yeah, houses. The autarch keeps his
their concubines.
Concubines,
from different houses. Yeah.
The nobility. Yeah, same basic premise.
Yeah.
Except rather than bother feeding all these hostages, they just aren't born yet. And you'd better cooperate. And so when you want a kid as an imperial palatine noble, you have to petition an office in the imperial capital to have a kid, and they will. And they've got your genes on file from when you were born, and they've got the genes of your spouse on file.
Right.
And they will tailor the embryo and deliver it to you, and make sure that it comes out okay.
Right.
Right. And so if you cross the emperor, no, your house is done.
Yeah.
Right.
No more
you can
kids.
try to have one of those misborns, but it's not going to work for you probably. Right.
It's like the opposite of. Do you ever see that movie Man of Steel, the Superman movie?
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of that, right? Where they had everybody was genetically kind of preordained to their occupation, and that's why their society was collapsing, except for Kal-El, who was the product of a natural birth. And he was kind of like the savior figure, right? So it's kind of like the opposite. It's similar to that, but that's like the natural birth.
I can see that. That was the best part of the movie.
That was, yeah. Their society was collapsing.
I hear Snyder's doing some more space opera stuff here in the future. I'm kind of interested.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the best. Yeah, that was the best part of the movie, was the beginning. But yeah, it reminded me of that in a lot of ways. And then you have like homunculi too, like you're like completely synthetic.
They're like replicants from Blade Runner, basically.
Right.
And they'll be designed to various purposes, be that aesthetic or functional. Right. You may like Adrian's family has and this is like mentioned in one scene. They have a herald who looks like a little devil, right? Like he's a little imp man.
Gosh.
Who just announces people at parties. It's not dwelt upon, but like there are whole groups of synthetic people. There's the dryads, for instance, who are they were designed as a slave labor population. They can photosynthesize in space, right? So you don't have to feed them, and they're green, and they look like tree people a little bit. It's a little bit of a Star Trek joke. You green people,
right? Green women.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so you've got them as well. And Adrian's increasingly bothered by the fact that he cannot have children.
Right.
Like it bothers him because he's getting quite, he lives for centuries, right? And that's a very lonely way to do it. So that bothers him, but is also, unlearning some of his native class prejudices because he works with these gladiators and he really likes these sort of, ordinary people, right? And realizes that, they're not just, the peasants, right? And so he unlearns a lot of those social things, but he also learns that some of the imperial prescriptions against, like, plugging your Dr. Octopus arms into your back is probably, probably a good thing.
Yeah, that's what makes it so interesting, because it's like everybody, even the people you don't like, they all have a point, right? They all have like at least one thing that they're right about, you know. Like even his dad, who is not a very good man, he's not wrong when you have to be stern sometimes, but he's like a monster all the time.
Right? Yeah, he's not a pleasant guy, but the thing I really but I have a lot of fondness for my unpleasant characters.
Yeah.
In no small part because in a perverse way they're the most fun to write.
Yeah.
Right.
The only one who I would say didn't have, who is not correct so far about I don't think anything, is Karn Sagara, which is interesting. I think.
Well, he likes art. He's got that going for him.
He's got good taste. He's got good taste for a villain.
Yeah, he's aesthetically correct.
Yes. But yeah, his worldview is completely wrong. You know, it's.
Oh yeah. I do not agree with Karn in any way. Right. You know, but he's very very fun character.
He was fun. I liked him a lot.
Very difficult one to write. The only character that's more difficult than Karn is Valka, who is of course the sort of female lead for the series.
Yeah.
And she's difficult just because she's so close to Hadrian all the time, and to see Hadrian from the outside is the exact opposite of what I do all the time.
Yeah.
But I like to tell that joke, right? Like the only person who's more complicated than this space robot Satan is Valka.
Oh gosh.
But and whom I love dearly. One can love a fake person that you made up, but they are really fun to write. I love writing. I love writing the unpleasant characters. The thing I like about Hadrian's dad is that, sort of hard and unpleasant as he is, his sense of personal responsibility is on point. Right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like he absolutely understands that, like, I am the lord of this, continent, basically, because he doesn't rule the whole planet.
Right. He's
sort of a district manager, if you will, archon, and but he knows that, like, that's his place, right? And he needs to. Now he has a very specific goal, and it is over a lot of the bodies, the people that he, is supposed to be, ruling. But he knows that he has to achieve what he wants to achieve for his family.
Yeah.
And he's at least got that I think.
Yeah, he's not completely warped, right? He's not completely broken. He's got a few things wrong, and that's kind of makes him a monster. But it's like he's still got this like core to him that he's right about certain things, right?
About something,
yeah,
right?
About something.
And that goes back to the Chantry thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, as originally conceived, they weren't right about anything.
Right.
And you can't tell a good story if, one side is right about everything and the other side is wrong about everything.
Right.
Because there's no story there. That's it. You just told me everything, right? Sweetness and Light must win against Team Meanie Face. And that's a wrap, folks. Like, someone's gonna punch somebody, and credits will roll. We're done, right? Like, it's there's nothing to sink your teeth into. And so, like I said, sort of my obsession at this point is to try and give everyone a say, right? Mm-hmm. And a substantive one, right? So it's been a big part of my focus.
Yeah. Let's see. A couple more things, and then I'll let you go to bed.
No, you're fine.
So Hadrian he's kind of got this like romantic sort of, I think you described him once in another podcast or something. He's kind of like a Lord Byron sort of figure. And he's raised on these like myths and stories of like Earth's past, heroes and legends. And then there's this great quote in Demon in White that I'm going to read, and then we can talk about it. So, as a child, we believe the world enchanted because age has not killed the magic we are born with. As we grow, the simple spells of new sights in far-off places no longer work on us, and we grow cynical and cold. But I was old even then, a young man of 110, 115 years. I no longer recall. But in age once more, the magic returns, if you are willing and open to it. Though young wood does not burn for the moisture in it, as a lonely cinder may be catch in old, dry wood and spark a great burning, so do such small things kindle the hearts of those with eyes and time to see. And if you burn long enough and bright as I have done, you come back to that simple truth of childhood. The world of the scientists, of engineers, and mathematicians does not exist. We live in stories in the demon-haunted world of myth. We are heroes and We are heroes and dragons, evil and divine. I felt almost that Simeon stood beside me as I stood beside Karnsagara in the halls of the Undying, and in the perverse ark in Eden he kept bottled beneath his hanging pyramid. How wondrous is it that we walk the same universe as such legends, that a man on earth might breathe the same air as Alexander, as the first Caesar, as the god emperor and the Americanii he destroyed. So that's a great quote, and kudos to you. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you. I am proud of that one. I'd forgotten about it. But
yeah, I read that. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like what my podcast is kind of like focusing on. So he was raised on these stories of all these like, and he at least initially when he was maybe more naive, he kind of self-consciously was being dramatic, right? So he would be over dramatic to be kind of like the heroes in his stories, and then he, as far as I can tell now, in Demon in White, from what I've read, he kind of becomes that. You know, he doesn't like pretend to do it anymore. He kind of just is that character.
Yeah.
So what role do these stories play for him, and was that good or bad for his like development? And what do you think stories? I mean, besides the quote which you wrote, right? What do stories do for us, like as real living people?
Well, I'm gonna steal from Wolfe again, right? Mm-hmm. There's another bit in New Sun where he says something like, "Of all the things that are in the world, only stories and music we gave ourselves, mm-hmm. and it's hard not to love best those things which you made yourself, right?" And stories in particular, right, are the one thing that really separates us. In like a substantive sense from like other animals, right? Mm-hmm. Crows use tools, whales can communicate, right? But like we tell stories and you learn from stories, right? We can go, and this is sort of a Petersonian thing, we can go and read, a story so that the characters can die horribly so we don't have to, right?
Yeah.
And that's true, right? There's a wine brand that's pretty common in America called Stag's Leap, right? Mm-hmm. You see it in any grocery store. And Stag's Leap is a specific place, I think, in Napa County in California, where there's a ravine that's like just wide enough that deer think they can jump it.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe some of them can, but they turn up dead at the bottom of the ravine all the time, right? And if deer could only say, I saw Steven try that and he's dead now, then that would not happen anymore, right? And that's the thing, right? So all of these myths that Hadrian sort of lives in when he's growing up in his, his father's castle and cannot, really leave it, right? Those are the stories that he kind of like he wants to live in, right? Because he's trapped at home. But when he actually has to start living in them, right, he makes a lot of the same mistakes, right? But he does avoid certain other ones, right? And that's sort of what we all do, right? We grow up, thinking that, we can be like, for me, it was Luke Skywalker, right? And, you try, right, to fit into these molds, right? And to sort of act, nobly or with grace or whatever, mm-hmm. right? Virtue you're thinking about at a given moment, or all of them, if you're, an overachiever / trying to do it right. And so he tries to live up to these examples, right? And this too is a world, where those stories still mean something. Because one of the things that science fiction tends to do is erase all of history. They figure, 10,000 years from now, no one's reading Gilgamesh anymore, right? And like almost Picard. Nobody's reading. What's that?
Unless you're Jean-Luc Picard,
right? But like, but almost nobody's reading Gilgamesh now, that's right? True. But there are people who do. Right, mm-hmm. And the fact that it's made it this far only increases the chances that it's going to make it farther. And there's a law for that. I forget whose law it is. Right?
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah,
I think it's something like
and stuff and all. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something Taleb talks about. I can't remember. But there's no reason this stuff's going to disappear, especially now. I mean, there are so many copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. They can't all get deleted, or
right.
burned. It's very hard to live in Fahrenheit 451 now. The real danger is just that nobody wants to read, right? You don't have to burn the books. Yeah. Certainly to read Gilgamesh. And so, but like I said, this is a culture that like took all of the furniture from these stories, and it wasn't just stories, right? It was fashion, cuisine, and music, and everything, right?
Well, they combine them too. So like Arthur, you put like El Cid and King Arthur together, so it's Cid Arthur, right? So like they take these stories,
but I combine them too with this is I'm especially proud of this dumb pun, and like I shouldn't pat myself on the back, right? Like it never looks cool in a podcast, but it's Siddhartha.
We can't
right?
see you pat yourself in the back.
Well, I'm not doing it. My hands are on the desk. But he's also Siddhartha, right? Right. Wow. So it's a conflation of the Arthur and the Buddha story that turned into a religion of its own, right?
Wow.
And that was just such like a silly joke that taking it seriously was something I thought would be interesting. And so that's one of the more improbable elements of the world building. I'll give you that. But at the same time, this idea that there might be a bunch of warrior monks that like have the Knights of the Round Table as their bodhisattvas and like try to emulate the sort of like eightfold path, but it's chivalric virtue is a really interesting thing, and it's a very like minor bit of the world building. It doesn't impinge on the story very much, but it is absolutely something I want to do in like in more detail in a subsequent volume once I brush up on my my Buddhist texts a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that's fun. But like all these pieces are still around, right? And Hadrian is one of those people who still reads Gilgamesh, right? And part of that, I think, is just that I really like Gurney Halleck in Dune, and he's always quoting the space Bible at people, and a bunch of poetry and things like that. And I've always been that guy, right? Who will I used to wait tables, and like every like Mother's Day, I was like, all right, what's more into the breach, dear friends? And I did like the whole spiel, right? Close the wall up with our English dead, and I would sometimes try to freestyle in, lasagna related lines, but, because it's an Italian restaurant, but like that was always me. And that part of Hadrian is me in a way that, because people tend to think that like, oh, your main character is a self-insert, right? But no, but there are always pieces of me in all of these characters.
I don't remember you blowing up a son and committing genocide. I think I would have been on the news.
I had to get off social media for a reason.
Oh, right. It's a metaphorical son, metaphorical genocide.
Yeah. Oh no, I just mean like it was pushing me there. It's gonna go build my rocket ship. Can it go blow out the sun? But yeah. So all of these little bits of myths and legends, and in weird pieces, like you say, there's a really fun confusion with a bit of the Silmarillion and some Greek mythology in Book 4 that I'm excited about.
Oh, nice. There have been Tolkien references in the book. I think in Empire of Silence you referenced, if only there was a word to describe a sudden good turn, like at the end of the story, like a
there were a couple really special jokes.
Yeah, I'm like, I see what you did. And I'm like,
Hadrian has clearly read Lord of the Rings, but he is not so gauchious to make a really explicit call out. He doesn't say Frodo's name at any point, because that would break immersion, right?
It would, yeah.
That's too much, but like it's there. It's there. There are a couple, because like if I get one consistent strain of criticism, and maybe this is a note to end on, because it's sort of ties back to my mission statement, I guess, as a writer. It's that I clearly love my ancestors too much, right? There's like they can see the Dune, they can see the Star Wars, although but I repeat myself. They can see Tolkien, and was that a Doctor Who joke? Yes, it was. Things like that. But no one ever is upset about the Dante, right? No one's upset about
Shakespeare,
the Buddhism or the Shakespeare, the recurring Shakespeare joke.
Right.
No one has ever commented on, and I think I'm hilarious, but I digress. And the thing is, right, like those are all a part of our tradition as science fiction writers, right, and readers, right, and that's my culture or a part of it, and of course it influenced me, and I feel like including these grace notes, especially in a way that like I think is meaningful for the world building and sort of thematizing, right, is a way to homage those writers and to sort of be grateful to them and not to constantly be trying to reinvent the wheel, whatever that means.
Well, the fact that you're kind of responding to Dune, also you're doing that series honor in that way, because it's like worthy enough for you to comment on and try to maybe correct in some ways, thus building that tradition, because that's what like C.S. Lewis would do with people like what's his name? I can't remember now. George Orwell, I think, or Arthur C. Clarke. I think he did that with Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh yeah, Space Trilogy is kind of a Clarke response.
Yeah, so they kind of.
But there's like enough there, right? There's enough there to talk about.
Right.
And I'm not saying that like Dune is bad. It's like my third favorite science fiction fantasy.
You're kind of working off that tradition, and that's what the medieval authors would do. They would take the story that they've been given and they tweak it in some way, they make it their own in some way, but they would keep a lot of it the same, right? And they did kind of pass it forward that way.
Yeah. Well, that's what a culture is, right? Yeah. And this is what's so frustrating to me. Like, all the people, like, the idea of, like, of stealing ideas is this, like, really sort of modern marketplace thing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
We talk about, like, entertainment franchises, right? A franchise is like, I own this McDonald's, right? Right, but it's like one of McDonald's. We talk about developing a new property, right? As if it's a lot that you're putting a gas station on,
right?
And that's not a culture, right?
Yeah.
And this whole attitude just vexes me. 12 Ways to Sunday, and I owe a lot to Dune. I owe a lot to Lord of the Rings. I owe a lot to Dante and Shakespeare, right? And Gilgamesh, right? And all of these things. And to silo myself and pretend that didn't happen, so that I can develop a property to put my franchise on,
right?
And start selling, good burgers is, not. Like that's not what art is. That's not what a culture is, and we need art and a culture.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to be so atomized as to pretend that Dune does not exist.
Right.
It would be lying to my readers, not to acknowledge that these things have mattered to me.
Right.
And
makes sense.
The line is drawn here to quote Dune. Like that's. Attitude of the knife. I'm done. That's my point.
That's something, and I have to have an obligatory Tim Powers reference, because I think I've referenced him in every single podcast I've done so far.
I love Tim. He's the best.
Well, it's something he does too, right? So that's something he explicitly does in his novels. He'll take literature like that he likes, and somehow, many of his novels are about poets, about even like all these romantic poets, and he'll take their poetry and he'll make it his own in his own way, and he'll turn it like some phrase that they had in their poetry, like in Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, right? So he'll like, she was clearly writing that when she was under the influence of this demon, right? Or something, right? And so like this is what she means when she was referencing this in her poem, and so he'll take that and he'll kind of make it his own, and he'll make it something new, while still building off of and drawing attention to these older works of art.
And the other thing I love about Tim too is he doesn't discriminate, right? My favorite, my favorite sort of, it's almost a joke, right? Is he starts The Stress of Her Regard with an epigram from Clark Ashton Smith, right? Who's like, he's sort of, he's like Lovecraft, right? He's like the Lovecraft that nobody remembers anymore, except us, like super nerds, right? And to start a book about Lord Byron and Percy Shelley with an epigram from this weird tales, spec fic writer from the 30s no one remembers, right, is saying this is just as good, right?
Yep.
And he underlines that, right? He puts it right in the front of the book, and it's like, think about that.
Yeah,
and
it's true.
And he's right?
Yeah.
Like, because that stuff is great. Smith is awesome, and he, for all of the credit that Lovecraft gets, great, because it's never actually the person who, like, invents these things that gets the credit. Like, William Hope Hodgson was doing cosmic horror before Lovecraft was writing, right? But Lovecraft did it best, or most famously?
He got however it worked out, he got the credit for it, right? And
of course, not until he died, right, which is tragic, and,
Yeah, well, Tolkien didn't invent fantasy, right?
Of course not, right?
Right.
But is he outclassed everyone else? I think so.
Yeah, like he did it. He definitely did it better than most. But he didn't invent it, right? He didn't, and he wasn't even, like, Tolkien wasn't even super popular when he was first published. It wasn't until, like, the 70s, after the hippies got a hold of his books, that it became, and, like, Led Zeppelin and stuff like that, made it more popular. And it wasn't until, like, later
God does work in mysterious ways.
He does. It's crazy. And, like, the very last people on Earth who you'd think would identify with Tolkien, like the hippie people, because of, Tolkien's environmental, consciousness in his books is clearly there. But it's like embedded in this broader context of, like, traditionalism, Right.
Well. So environmentalism's always been, a traditional conservative staple, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's only been uncoupled from that in really, like, the last 70 years, and particularly in an American context, right? And that's another thing too, right? Like, no one's on the other side of that issue, right? Like, nobody wants to live in, like, the Captain Planet villains world. Like, nobody wants to, like, choke when they go outside and, like, there to be garbage everywhere.
Right.
Like, they may drop a candy wrapper because, no one's looking, because people are, not, all good, but, like, nobody wants, like, everybody sees, like, an exploded trash bag on the side of the road, and they're like, the world is going to the dogs.
Right.
And they aren't eating the trash. Like, it's, like, no one, it's such a strange thing. It's such a strange thing that, like, that is, like, the little bit of Tolkien that people will try to, like, deconstruct Tolkien around and try to turn him into someone he wasn't.
Right.
But that is maybe another show.
Yeah, no, it's oh man, this has been fun.
I had a great time. I'm sorry I rambled so much. Oh yeah.
No, you're fine. I got one more question. It's a bit goofy, and I've been trying to ask this with everybody. So this podcast is called I Might Believe in Fairies, because I'm rather agnostic on the subject of whether or not fairies exist. I had someone on my show, the second episode. She is convinced fairies are real, and it's a very fun episode. She's also a very devout Catholic. And there's nothing in church teaching that says fairies are or are not real. But I want to ask you, Christopher Ruocchio, do you believe in fairies?
My gut instinct is that I do not.
Okay.
But maybe what people are referring to as fairies or something else that I might believe in. So sure. I don't know. Maybe it's something else. But if we're talking, like, little, winged people, I'm not so sure. Certainly not in, like, in a fossil record sense.
I see. No.
But
that's a fun question, like, to ask people, and you'd be surprised at the different answers I've been getting.
I bet. I mean, it's an interesting question. I wish they were real.
Yeah.
I wish there were elves and wizards. Not so much dragons, but dragons are kind of cool. But,
dragons are cool. Tolkien thought so too. He just didn't want them in London,
Yeah, like over there.
Yeah, like cool, man.
My brother would be all over that, but not me. Yeah.
Well, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. This was a lot of fun, man. I appreciate you coming on my show.
Thank you for having me. This was an absolute blast. I know I talk a bit much, but I hope we haven't lost everybody with my nonsense. So.
No, it's been fun. So everybody go out and buy Christopher Ruocchio's The Sun Eater series. Buy them all, read them all right now. They're fantastic. Thank you for listening to this episode of I Might Believe in Fairies. Please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow me on Twitter at Aaron Erber and like me on Facebook. If you're excited to see where the podcast is going and want to offer some support for the project, you can find me on Patreon. Music is by Alexander Nakarada, and podcast art was designed by my wonderful sister-in-law, Linnea Kisby. Until next time, talk to you soon.